I want to tell you about the rock hammer first. Not because it's the most important part of what happened at Falcon Lake, because it's where the whole thing starts. Because of what it meant to the thing in the woods that it never once understood. My uncle Mike kept it on his desk. Worn wooden handle, the varnish rubbed away where the grip naturally fell. Steel head gone dull from decades of use. The pick end scratched and chipped. It had belonged to my grandfather. Passed it to Mike when Mike left for university. And Mike had carried it into the field, probably 1,000 times in 30 years of plasma, physics research and amateur prospecting. He was that kind of man, credentialed and brilliant in the formal world, happiest with his boots muddy and a hand lens around his neck. The entity, when it finally noticed the hammer, dismissed it. I know that now. I've had a long time to think about the sequence of events, and I'm certain of it. The thing spent 43 years watching humans fumble around. That lake and that forest, studying us the way a graduate student studies a colony of ants. And when it looked at my uncle and saw a middle-aged man with a worn-out hand tool and a notebook full of sketches, it made an assessment. The assessment was wrong. That was the only mistake it ever made. But once was enough. I was 20 years old when I arrived at Falcon Lake. I drove up from Chicago in a truck that burned oil and pulled left. And I remember crossing into Manitoba thinking the country looked like the end of the world, not in a bad way, just empty and honest about it. Birch trees and cold water and rock outcrops and sky. My mother had died somewhere in these woods 2 years before, and my father and I had reached the point where we couldn't be in the same room without grief turning into something uglier than grief, so I left. Mike met me at the cabin door. He was 55, lean, with the kind of pale that comes from spending too much time indoors, staring at data, and not enough time sleeping. He shook my hand and held it a second longer than necessary, and I understood that he'd been waiting for me. That he was relieved I'd come. "Your mother's files are in the second room," he said. "Don't read them tonight. Have some food first." I read them that night. I couldn't not. My mother's name was Donna. She was a botanist. Not a credentialed one. Not the kind who publishes papers, but the kind who knows every plant in a 200-kilometer radius by its Latin name, and can tell you its seasonal behavior, its soil preferences, its relationships with neighboring species, from memory. She'd come to Falcon Lake because Mike had called her about an anomaly in the vegetation near the 1960 Seaven site, a patch where nothing grew quite right, where the soil chemistry was off in ways that didn't match any known contaminant. She was cataloging what she found. She was found 3 weeks later at the edge of that clearing, with burns on the left side of her head and across upper torso. The burns were the grid pattern. I'd seen the photographs in the coroner's file before I left Chicago, and I'd looked at them, the way you look at something that can't be real, the way your brain simply refuses to accept the pattern it's seeing. A grid, perfectly regular. Each line maybe a centimeter wide, the spacing between them about 3 centimeters. The burns were deep. Mike had spent 2 years trying to get someone in an official position to acknowledge what the burn pattern meant. He had files 2 inches thick, the 1967 incident, the original witness's account, the RCMP reports, the Department of National Defense memos that said in careful bureaucratic language that the samples collected from the site were radioactive, and the origin was undetermined. He had his own data, electromagnetic readings, soil analysis, vegetation surveys going back a decade. He had a theory that the anomaly near the lake wasn't a landing site but a monitoring station, fixed point the entity returned to regularly, had been returning to for decades, to take samples and make observations. It watches, he told me, that first night, sitting across the table from me, with the files spread between us. That's what I've come to believe. It doesn't come here to colonize or to communicate or to make contact on any meaningful sense. It watches. We are a subject of study to it. Long-term, patient study. And my mother was in the study area, I said. Yes, and it killed her. He was quiet for a moment. I don't think it intended to kill her. I think it was examining her. I think the burns were incidental to whatever examination it was conducting. I sat with that for a long time. The idea that my mother had died as a side effect of something's curiosity, that she'd been studied the way a laboratory sample is studied, and the instrument had simply run too hot. "What does it look like?" I asked. No one who's seen it clearly has been able to describe it clearly. The 1967 witness described a disc-shaped craft with grid-like vents. I'm not sure the craft and the entity are separate things. I'm not sure it has a fixed form. He picked up the rock hammer from the desk and turned it in his hands, the old habit. What I know is that it's been here a long time, Dan. Long enough to have a very detailed picture of what we are and what we're capable of. And based on its behavior, I believe its assessment of us is not flattering, meaning it thinks we're harmless, meaning it thinks we're simple. He set the hammer down. It hasn't taken any precautions in 40 years. It comes back to the same site. It uses the same approach vectors. It's never altered its behavior in response to our investigations. Either it doesn't know we're investigating, or it knows and doesn't care. Do you think it is? He almost smiled. I think it knows. I think it finds us mildly interesting but essentially manageable. Like watching mice in a field. You observe them. You occasionally handle one. You note their behavior. And you don't particularly worry about them. I looked at the rock hammer. Then it's never met anyone who was actually paying attention, I said. I met Shayna 2 days later. She worked at the general store at the edge of town. And she'd grown up in Falcon Lake. And she knew the woods around the lake better than anyone living. She was 22. Quiet. The particular alertness of someone who spent her life outdoors reading terrain. She'd known my mother. Donna had come into the store several times during those 3 weeks. Bought field supplies. Plants with Shayna for an hour once about a patch of unusual lichen near the old prospecting claims. When I told her why I was there, she didn't try to talk me out of going into the woods. She said, "I'll show you where your mother was working." We went the next morning. The clearing was about 4 kilometers in from the nearest trail, and it sat on a shelf of exposed granite above a creek bed. The vegetation around the edges was strange. Mike hadn't been wrong about that. The birch trees on the north side of the clearing had a color off from what they should have been. A dullness in the leaves that I didn't have the botany to name, but Shayna did. She crouched at the edge of the clearing and pointed out 3 separate plant species whose growth patterns were wrong, bent or stunted in ways that had nothing to do with light or water. The rock at the center of the clearing was scorched. Not obviously, shriek. Not dramatically. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you might have thought it was a natural discoloration, lichen burned off by a lightning strike. But the pattern was there if you looked. The same grid. I stood in that clearing for a long time. Shayna stood next to me and didn't say anything, which I was grateful for. "She was here," I said finally. "Yes. And the thing that burned her comes back here." "I think so. I think it has for a long time." I took out Mike's notebook. He'd given me the current one before we left, told me to add to it if I observed anything. And I started sketching the clearing, the rock formation, the scorched area, the angles of the bent trees, the direction that vegetation seemed to orient toward, which was northeast, which was the direction of the lake. Shayna watched me sketch. "You're like him," she said. "Your uncle. Is that a good thing?" She thought about it. "He's still alive," she said. "We heard it that afternoon. Not saw, heard. A sound that wasn't quite a sound. More a pressure change in the air above the tree line, and then a heat that had no source. A radiating warmth that came from no direction in particular, but was suddenly present the way the smell of smoke, present before you find the fire." Shayna grabbed my arm without speaking. We stood very still. The birds went quiet. That was the thing I noticed. Not gradually, the way birds go quiet at dusk. Instantly, completely, as if something had thrown a switch. Then a light through the trees to the northeast. Not a point of light. A diffuse glow, amber and slightly wrong, the color of heated metal but too soft for that. We ran. Not in panic. We didn't scream, didn't drop anything, but we moved fast and we moved quietly, and we didn't stop until we were 2 kilometers back down the trail. And the birds had started again behind us. Shayna's hand was still on my arm. We looked at each other. "That's it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. We went back to the cabin, and I wrote down everything I'd observed in Mike's notebook. The time, the temperature change, the direction of approach, the sound, the pressure sound, and its approximate duration, the light, its color, its position relative to the tree line, its estimated distance, the behavior of the birds before and after. Mike read it that night. He read it twice, slowly, and then he looked at me. You timed the pressure change, he said. Reflex, I count things. He nodded slowly. Your mother did that too, counted things, she couldn't help it. He was quiet for a moment. The pressure change duration you recorded, 4 seconds, is consistent with my 2019 data from the same site. It hasn't varied. Same approach vector, northeast, the lake, he turned a page. It hasn't changed its approach vector in 11 years of my observations. Probably longer. I thought about that. A thing intelligent enough to travel between wherever it came from and the Canadian wilderness, to monitor a site for decades without being caught, to leave burns on a woman that were precise enough to map the geometry of its exhaust system. And it used the same flight path every time, year after year, decade after decade. It doesn't think we can track it, I said. Why would it? What have we given it to suggest otherwise? That was the right question. And the answer, if I'm honest, was nothing. The 1967 witness had stumbled on it by accident. My mother had been in the wrong place. Mike had been studying it for a decade with instruments it presumably didn't know about, but he hadn't acted on what he'd learned. He'd filed reports that went nowhere, compiled data that sat in folders and waited. For what? I wasn't sure he knew. But I was 20 years old and my mother was dead. And I had 4 seconds of pressure change, and a fixed approach vector and a notebook, and something in me that my father would have called stubbornness and my uncle would have called scientific method. Decided that 43 years of being observed without consequence was going to end. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I didn't go back into those woods looking for a fight. I'm not built for that, and I'm not telling this story to sound like something I wasn't. I went back because I wanted to understand. I went back because understanding felt, at that point in my life, the only thing I had any control over. My mother was dead. My father was a stranger. Yes. I was 20 years old, in a foreign country in the woods with a rock hammer and a notebook, and the only move I had was to pay attention. It turns out that was the one move the entity had never accounted for. The next 2 weeks were the most methodical of my life. I went out to the clearing every day, sometimes with China and sometimes alone. I mapped it, not just sketched it, triangulated it, using a surveying tape and compass bearings and the techniques Mike had taught me in 3 evenings of patient instruction. I established fixed reference points and recorded measurements to them from every observation position. I noted every change in vegetation from one day to the next. I recorded temperature at 6 points around the clearing every hour I was there, using 3 cheap thermometers Mike had in his supplies. China proved invaluable in ways I hadn't anticipated. She knew which trees were healthy and which weren't. And the difference mattered. The unhealthy ones clustered on the northeast side of the clearing, the side the entity approached from. And the pattern of damage in the bark and leaves was consistent with repeated low-level heat exposure over many years. She showed me where the original 1967 damage was still faintly visible in the rock formation. The original scorch, fainter now, but still there if you knew the geology. Slightly different in mineral composition than the surrounding granite, because the heat had altered it at depth. I added all of it to the notebook. On the 8th day it came back. We were at the clearing when it arrived. Mid-afternoon, clear sky, the kind of October cold that gets in under your collar. The pressure change came first. I had my watch out, counting, and then the heat, and then the light through the trees. 4 seconds from first pressure to first light. Northeast approach, exactly as logged. We didn't run this time. I know how that sounds. Shayna knew how it sounded too. She looked at me when I didn't move, and her expression was the look you give someone who might be an idiot or might know something you don't. I held up 2 fingers and pointed at the notebook. She understood. We stayed, kept my eyes on my instruments. Temperature at the northeast station had spiked 8 degrees in under a minute. The light through the trees was intensifying, moving, not fast, a steady drift. And now I could hear something in addition to the pressure change, a low subsonic vibration that I felt more than heard, the kind of thing that makes your back teeth ache. I was writing continuously, every reading, change. Not because I had a plan at that moment, but because my uncle had taught me that data is the only argument that survives contact with the unbelievable. The light crested the tree line. I looked up. I've tried many times to describe what I saw, and I've never done it well. So, I'll just tell you what I wrote in the notebook. Approximately 9 meters across, disc geometry, surfaces that seem to absorb light unevenly, structure on the lower surface, similar to the burn pattern in the rock. No visible propulsion. Temperature at Northeast Station now 14 degrees above baseline. Time elapsed since first pressure change. 6 minutes, 40 seconds. It hovered at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 meters up, and it was still, just still. Watching, I wrote down the grid geometry. The spacing between the vent elements, estimated from the distance and the size reference of the trees below it. The angle of the lower surface relative to the horizon. The position of the highest light emission points. Then Shayna gripped my arm. One of the grid vents had opened. Not all of them. One panel on the lower surface had shifted. It was hard to describe, like a pore dilating. And from it came a beam of concentrated light that hit the rock at the center of the clearing. The rock at the center of the clearing, where the original 1967 scorch was. The same spot. After 43 years, the exact same spot. I had time to think. It's sampling. It's come back to the same reference point to take a sample, the way a scientist returns to the same plot to take a core sample. And it's been doing this for 43 years. And it's been doing it in the same spot in the same way because we've never given it any reason to do otherwise. Then the beam moved. Slowly at first, then tracking toward us. The entity had noticed we hadn't run. The entity was adjusting. We ran. We ran differently than we had the first time. Not in panic, in a route. I'd spent 8 days learning the terrain around that clearing, and I knew where we were going, and we went there fast. Through the birch, on the south side of the clearing, where the ground was solid. Down the creek drainage, where the trees were dense overhead. Behind us I could feel the entity moving. The pressure change was continuous now, not a pulse. The heat on the back of my neck was real. Sheena was ahead of me. She took a turn I would have missed, and suddenly we were in a rock cut. A natural channel in the granite that ran east for maybe 200 meters. Tight enough overhead that the entity couldn't follow directly. The heat faded, the pressure faded. We felt, the entity change direction somewhere above us, moving away, recalculating. We came out the far end of the cut, and didn't stop walking until we hit the trail. That night, Mike listened to my account. He listened without interrupting, which I'd come to understand meant he was treating it seriously. When I finished, he picked up the notebook and read what I'd written. The vent geometry, he said. You estimated the element spacing. About 40 centimeters. Be off by 10% at that distance. He pulled a folder from his files and showed me a sketch, a hand sketch done in pencil, old paper. The witness from 1967 had drawn the grid pattern on the craft from memory. The element spacing in his sketch, translated to the scale of the craft as he'd described it, was consistent with what I'd measured. The same craft, I said. Yes, 43 years in the same craft. Or the same type. I can't tell you which. He set the folder down. What I can tell you is that your estimate of the vent angle and your temperature readings together tell me something I didn't have before. He went to his own notebook and worked for a moment. The heat output from a single vent panel, at the angle and temperature you recorded, isn't lethal at 30 meters. But at 2 or 3 meters, it would produce the burn pattern. Yes, we sat with that. It examined your mother, he said. It got closer than it intended to, or she moved, or something changed, and she burned. She didn't run, I said. I'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks. My mother's file, the one Mike had shown me that first night, included the botanical notes she'd been making the day she was found. She'd been cataloging the lichen on that rock. The scorch lichen, as I'd come to think of it, the community of organisms that had colonized the altered mineral surface from the 1967 exposure and thrived on its unusual chemistry. My mother had found a plant community she'd never seen before, and she'd been too absorbed in cataloging it to notice what was coming. She didn't run, Mike agreed. She was writing things down. I sat there in the lamplight of that cabin with the notebook in my hands, and I thought about my mother crouched over a rock with her own notebook, and about the entity hovering over her, making its assessments, studying her the way she was studying the lichen, and finding her, I was certain, no more threatening than the lichen. That was the thing. That was what I kept coming back to. The entity had been studying us for 43 years, and it had reached a conclusion. Conclusion was that we were safe to approach, that we were manageable, that our tools were primitive, and our observations clumsy, and our responses predictable. The conclusion wasn't entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. I spent 3 days working through my files with a focus I'd never applied to anything before. Not the biology or the physics. I didn't have the background for those. What I was looking for was behavioral pattern, the entity's behavior, approach vectors, site visit timing, duration of visits, what it sampled and when, what it responded to and what it ignored. Mike had 11 years of field data. It was meticulous, careful. The work of a trained scientist who'd given up trying to convince anyone else that the work mattered and had simply continued doing it because the alternative was not knowing. There were gaps, but the overall picture was clear. The entity returned to the Falcon Lake site on a roughly seasonal schedule, heaviest in spring and fall. It had 3 approach vectors, northeast from the lake being the primary, north-northwest from open bog being secondary, and a tertiary that Mike had only observed twice, coming from directly above. It always approached the clearing. It always sampled the same reference points. It never deviated, never. In 11 years of observation, Mike had never recorded a deviation. It's not cautious, I said on the 3rd evening. It's not cautious because it doesn't think it needs to be. Correct. Has it ever showed any indication that it's aware of your monitoring stations? He was quiet for a moment. Once, in 2021, my temperature sensor on the northeast perimeter failed 2 days before a scheduled visit. The batteries had run down. I replaced them the morning of the visit, and the entity arrived at its usual time and did not appear to have noticed the gap, but... He paused. But I've always wondered if it didn't notice, or if it noticed and simply didn't care. Because a mouse noticing your boot doesn't change whether your boot can crush it. Yes, I nodded. So the question is, whether we can give it a reason to reconsider that assessment, or it decides we need to be managed rather than just observed. He looked at me carefully. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about the approach vector. The northeast corridor from the lake. You said it's the primary, the one it uses most often, the one it used when it found my mother. Yes. The rock cut where Chaina led us. Does that intersect the northeast corridor? He pulled out his topographic map. He found the rock cut, traced the northeast corridor. They didn't intersect, but they were close. The cut ran roughly parallel to the corridor at a distance of maybe 200 meters. Close enough, I said. He looked at me for a long time. Dan, it's survived in this universe long enough to cross whatever distance it crossed to get here. Whatever you're thinking. I'm not thinking about fighting it, I said. I'm thinking about making it reconsider its assessment. There's a difference. What I had was this: 43 years of behavioral data that said the entity was confident in its prediction of human behavior. It came, it observed, it sampled. We either didn't notice or we ran, and it returned to wherever it came from with its data. 43 years and not once had a human done anything it didn't expect. My mother hadn't run. That had surprised it. I was sure. Surprised it enough that it approached too close, opened the vent panel at too short a range. She'd been absorbed in her work and hadn't reacted to its presence at all, which was in its own way still the expected behavior. Humans, in its experience, were either unaware or panicked. Both were manageable. What it had never encountered was a human who had been paying attention for 3 weeks, who had triangulated its approach corridor to within 50 meters, who had measured its vent geometry and estimated its heat output at range, and who had a specific concrete plan built on those measurements. The plan was simple, embarrassingly simple, honestly. The entity had spent 43 years studying us, and its conclusion was that we were primitive. So I was going to use the most primitive tool I had. On the morning of October 14th, I went to the clearing with Chaina and a pack that weighed about 30 pounds. Mike didn't come. I'd asked him to stay at the cabin and monitor his remote instruments, give me real-time data on the approach timing. He'd agreed, reluctantly, after I'd walked him through the plan twice, and he couldn't find the flaw in the underlying logic. It's going to work or it isn't, he'd said finally, and if it doesn't, we run for the rock cut. Shayna and I reached the clearing by mid-morning. The sky was overcast, which I'd planned for. Mike's data showed the entity visited more frequently under overcast conditions, something about the electromagnetic environment. I set up at the edge of the clearing on the south side, the opposite side from the northeast corridor. The pack contained survey tape, the compass, 3 thermometers, the notebook, 2 hand lenses, and the rock hammer, and about 40 kilograms of data. Not literally in the pack, in my head. 11 years of Mike's field notes, plus 3 weeks of my own observations, plus 2 weeks of nothing but thinking, cross-referencing, calculating. Approach corridor, accurate to 50 meters. The hover altitude, accurate to about 10%. The vent geometry, the heat output curve at range. And the one measurement that mattered most, the one I'd spent 3 days extracting from Mike's data, the entity's minimum safe altitude above the granite formation at the center of the clearing. The altitude below which its exhaust, its sampling apparatus, would reflect off the granite rather than absorb into it. The altitude below which it would not descend. The granite at the center of the clearing was about 6 square meters of exposed rock, flat and dense. The entity had been sampling from it for 43 years. It always approached to within a consistent altitude. Mike's temperature data at the reference station let me calculate it, and that altitude was approximately 12 meters. Not lower. Not in 11 years of data. 12 meters was the number. The pressure change came at 2:17 in the afternoon. I was watching my watch. 4 seconds, northeast. I wrote it down. The entity came in on its primary vector, crossing the tree line to the northeast, and it was lower than I'd seen it before. Maybe 20 meters, coming in hot and direct, not the slow drift of a routine visit. It had tracked us from our last encounter. It had come back to the site where we'd been present and not run, and it was going to investigate. Good. I stepped out from the tree line into the center of the clearing. Not toward the entity, not in any aggressive posture. I walked to the reference point on the granite, the original 1967 scorch, the sample site it had used 43 times at minimum, and I crouched down next to it the way my mother had crouched. With the notebook open, with the hand lens out. And I started writing. The entity slowed. I could feel the pressure change shifting, the rhythm of it changing, which in Mike's data correlated with what he called a hover and assess phase. It had expected us to run. We hadn't run the last time either. Then we'd been at the edge of the clearing, not at the reference site. Now here was a human crouching over its sample point, writing in a notebook, and not reacting to its presence at all. I was watching the rock, the altered granite, the colonies of adapted lichen, faint geometry of the original scorch. I was writing genuine observations, because that's what my mother would have done, and because I needed my hands to be steady, and writing kept my hands steady. The entity descended. It came down to 18 meters, 15, 12, which was its minimum, which was the number in my head, the number I'd pulled out of 11 years of data. Then it came to 11. That was the deviation. Deviation. In 11 years of Mike's records. The entity had departed from its behavioral pattern because it had found something it needed a closer look at, something that didn't fit its model of human behavior. A human at the sample site, not running, apparently unconcerned with the 40 tons of alien craft overhead. 11 meters. The exhaust heat at 11 meters, from the vent geometry I'd estimated, was going to be high. The stone at 11 meters was going to get the full radiant load. I reached into the pack and took out the rock hammer. I placed the pick end of the hammer against the granite at the 1967 scorch point, and I struck. The sound was clean and sharp in the overcast quiet. A crack of steel on stone. The kind of sound that's been in the Canadian wilderness. Since the first prospectors came through with their tools, the sound of a person paying attention to what the rock is made of. A chip of granite flew up. I caught it. I held it up to the light. Then I wrote down what I saw. The entity had stopped descending. I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the rock chip, kept writing. But I could feel the temperature, which had been rising, plateau. The pressure, which had been building, steady. The entity was at 11 meters, and it had stopped, and it was doing the thing it always did. Observing, assessing, updating its model. The rock chip in my shirt pocket and struck the granite again. Another chip. I examined it. I wrote down the mineral composition, fracture pattern, the inclusions visible through the hand lens. I wrote down the temperature at the surface of the granite. I was measuring with the thermometer, held flat against the stone. I wrote down the ambient temperature and the differential and my estimate of the entity's current altitude based on the shadow angle. I was documenting its landing site, systematically, methodically, the way a scientist documents a subject of study. The entity didn't move for 4 minutes. I know because I was counting. Then it descended to 9 meters. 9 was below its minimum. 9 was below every data point Mike had ever recorded. The entity had just done something it had never done in 11 years of observation. A 1-year-old from Chicago was crouching over its crouching sample point with a rock hammer and a notebook and appeared to be conducting an investigation of his own. At 9 meters, the granite was going to get hot. At 9 meters, the original scorch point was going to absorb a heat load it hadn't absorbed since 196. 7 and the lichen. The adapted lichen, the community my mother had been cataloging, the organisms that had colonized the altered mineral surface and built a micro-ecosystem on 43 years of intermittent heat exposure, was going to burn. I was had about 30 seconds before that happened. I stood up, not quickly, not in a running posture. I stood up straight to face the entity directly and held up the notebook, open, facing it. Pages full of data, approach vectors, temperature readings, vent geometry estimates, altitude calculations, behavioral records, 43 years of the entity's activity, reconstructed by a mechanic's son with a surveying tape and a hand lens and nothing but time. I held it for 10 seconds. Then I closed the notebook, back in the pack, picked up the rock hammer, and walked out of the clearing to the south, unhurried, without running. Shayna was waiting 50 meters into the tree line. She hadn't been in the clearing. I'd asked her to watch from the south edge in case I needed the rock cut route, and she'd watched the whole thing. Her expression was the one I'd seen before, the one that hadn't yet decided whether I was an idiot. Behind me, the entity was still, then it rose. Not fast, deliberate, controlled, the same precision it always moved with. It rose back through 12 meters, 15, 20, clearing the tree line. Pressure change shifted back to its departure rhythm. The heat on my back faded. I listened to it go. The pressure sound faded northeast, back toward the lake, and then was gone. And the birds came back, and somewhere in the overcast sky above Falcon Lake, something was updating a model that had been 43 years in the making. We walked back to the cabin in silence. Shayna didn't ask any questions until we were inside with the door closed and the stove going. Mike was at his monitoring station, his data running. He turned to look at me when I came in. Temperature at the reference station hit a new maximum, he said. And then it left. Yes. He looked at the notebook in my hands. What did you do? I told him. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, and when I finished, he sat there for a long time looking at his data. You showed it the notebook, he said. Yes. You wanted it to understand that we'd been observing it, that we had its behavioral data. I wanted it to update its assessment, I said. I wanted it to understand that we weren't what it thought we were. That a man with a rock hammer and a notebook isn't just a man with a rock hammer and a notebook. Sheena had been quiet through all of this. Now she spoke. Do you think it understood? I thought about that. About what it would take, what it would mean. For a thing that had been studying us for 43 years, to look at an open notebook full of its own behavioral patterns and understand that the subject of study had been studying back. I think it understood that it had incomplete information, I said. I think that's enough. It came back once more. 3 days later, mid-morning, northeast vector, the same approach. I was ready. Mike was at his station. Shayna was with me at the clearing. It didn't come as low as it had. It held at 20 meters, the standard operational altitude, and it hovered for 6 minutes, longer than any routine visit, longer than any visit Mike had recorded. And then it left, no sampling, no examination, no vent panels opened. It came to the clearing and it looked, and then it went away. Mike's monitoring data from that morning showed something he'd never seen before. The entity had made 3 passes around the clearing perimeter before settling into the hover position. Not the approach from a fixed vector. A perimeter survey, as if it were trying to get a complete picture of what it was dealing with. Reassessings, Mike said. Yes, that's either very good or very bad. I'd thought about this too, the 2 possibilities. Either the entity had concluded we were more capable than it had believed, and had decided we weren't worth the risk of continued study, that the site wasn't worth visiting if the subjects had the capacity to observe and document the observer. Or it had concluded we were interesting enough to study more carefully from a distance with greater caution. I didn't know which it was. I don't know now. It hasn't come back to the Falcon Lake clearing in the threes or since. Mike would have told me, but that doesn't settle the question. It might be somewhere else, watching differently. It might have written us off as to trouble. It might be in a queue of data, waiting to be reviewed by something we don't have the framework to imagine. What I know is this. For 43 years, a thing capable of crossing the distance between whatever it calls home and a rocky clearing in Manitoba had operated without taking precautions. Because it had decided we were manageable, it had watched us and studied us and built a model of human behavior, and that model said, harmless, limited, predictable. And it was mostly right. Most of us are predictable. Most of us, when something large and hot and alien appears in the sky, run. Most of us leave the studying to something else. My mother crouched over a rock with her notebook open, cataloging organisms she'd never seen before, because she was the kind of person who couldn't walk past something interesting without trying to understand it. She didn't run. That got her killed, and I've lived with that for 3 years, and I'll live with it for the rest of my life. But I think it also confused the entity. Thank a woman who doesn't run, who stays at the sample point and keeps writing while something approaches her from overhead. I think that was a data point that didn't fit the model. I think my mother gave it its first incomplete result in 4 decades, and 2 years later, her son showed up with the rest of the data she'd collected and used it to demonstrate that incomplete results have consequences. The rock hammer is on my desk now. Mike gave it to me when I left Falcon Lake at the end of that October. Said my mother would have wanted me to have it. The varnish is still worn in the same places. The handle shaped by 30 years of my uncle's grip and before that by my grandfather's. The steel head still has the scratch pattern of 1,000 field trips. 1,000 samples chipped of 1,000 rock faces across the Canadian wilderness. It's not a weapon, it never was. That's what the entity never understood. A man with a rock hammer isn't armed. He's just paying attention. He's marking the rock, noting the mineral, writing it down, because that's what we do. Because we can't walk past something without needing to know what it is. Because knowing things for us is not a specialized activity, it's the reflex, the basic operation. The thing that happens before we decide whether to run. We've been doing it since we first picked up a rock and noticed the color was different from the one next to it. We've been doing it in woods and on glaciers and at the bottom of oceans and in orbit. And we were doing it when something descended on a Manitoba mechanic in 1967. And we were doing it when his story found its way to a physicist who spent a decade in the woods with instruments. And we were doing it when a 20-year-old drove up from Chicago with nothing but grief and stubbornness and found the files that connected all of the entity had 43 years of data on us. That's true, but it was missing the variable that changes everything, the one that says, given enough time, every subject eventually notices it's being studied. We noticed. I'm not naive enough to think that changes things in any large sense. Whatever it is, wherever it came from, it's been doing this long enough that one site in Manitoba isn't going to matter much in the accounting. There are probably other sites. There are probably other clearings, other rock formations, other behavioral patterns being logged in, whatever passes for a notebook where it comes from. But in one clearing, one corner of the Canadian wilderness, above one piece of altered granite with 43 years of scorch history, 20-year-old, with a rock hammer opened his notebook and turned it so the writing faced the sky. And the thing that had never taken precautions took a precaution. I'll take that. Mike still goes out to the clearing twice a year. He monitors his stations, records his readings, adds to the dataset. The dataset now has my observations folded into it, my triangulation work, temperature logs, my vent geometry estimates. And Mike has used all of it to build a more complete model than he'd had before. He's published nothing. He knows better than to try. But the model is there, in his notebooks, waiting for the day when someone with the right credentials and the right platform decides the data is worth something. Shayna is still in Falcon Lake, we write. She knows those woods better than anyone alive, and she keeps an eye on the clearing, in a way that's hard to explain to someone who wasn't there. Not surveillance, not the vigil of someone expecting a threat, but the kind of steady attention you give to something that matters to you. She told me once, in a letter, that the lichen on the reference point is still growing, that the unusual community my mother cataloged has spread about 2 meters to south in the 3 years since, that the scorch lichen, as I think of it, the organisms that built their entire world on 43 years of intermittent alien heat, are thriving. I found that easier to sit with than I expected. I've thought a lot about what my mother was actually doing that afternoon in the clearing. Not why she didn't run. I understand that now, and I've made my peace with it. What I think about is the work itself. She was cataloging a micro-ecosystem that shouldn't have existed, that had no explanation she would have accepted that day. That was built on an event no official body acknowledged. She was writing down what she saw because she was the kind of person who wrote down what she saw. And she was thorough, and she was patient, and she had the particular scientific stubbornness that says, it doesn't matter if anyone believes you later. What matters is the record. Record is in Mike's files. My observations, her observations, 11 years of Mike's data, the 1967 incident reports, the burns on the rock, the adapted lichen, the approach vectors, the vent geometry, the altitude minimum and the deviation from it. Everything except the moment in the clearing when I held up the notebook. I didn't write that down while it was happening. My hands were occupied. By the time I was back in the tree line with China, the adrenaline had leveled off enough to let me think clearly. And I stood there in the birch trees, and I wrote down what had happened. The entity's response to the notebook. The 3-minute stillness before it came lower. The second descent below its established minimum. The departure without sampling. I wrote it as a behavioral observation. Third person, no emotion in it, because the data doesn't need emotion, it just needs accuracy. Then I wrote a note at the bottom of the page in my own voice. Hypothesis. Entity has revised assessment of this site's subjects from harmless, dictable to uncertain lapable of observation. Behavioral change suggests discomfort with unknown variable. Unknown variable. A circle around that. That's us. That's always been us. The unknown variable in every encounter, every assessment, every model built by something that watched us with patience and intelligence and concluded it had us figured out. The thing that keeps not quite fitting the expected behavior. The thing that stops and looks up and asks what that is, and then writes it down and then passes the notebook to someone else who adds to it and passes it to someone else. The entity is somewhere. It's still running its observations, still updating its data, still building whatever model it's building of what we are and what we're capable of. It's had 43 years in one location and probably much longer across whatever other sites it maintains. And its sample size is enormous, and its methods are sophisticated, and its conclusions are, I'm sure, impressive in whatever form they take. Somewhere in that data now is an entry it didn't expect. A subject that noticed. A clearing where the expected behavior didn't manifest. A 20-year-old who drove up from Chicago and spent 3 weeks learning the terrain and 2 weeks working through field notes and 1 afternoon in clearing with a rock hammer and an open notebook. 1 data point out of 43 years of data. 1 deviation in the behavioral record. It's a thin margin. I know it's a thin margin, but data is cumulative. Deviations are noted. Models are updated. My grandfather carried the rock hammer into the Canadian wilderness for 30 years, looking at the rock, writing down what he saw. My uncle carried it for 30 more. My mother drove up from Chicago to catalog something unusual near Falcon Lake, and she kept writing even when she should have run, because the thing in front of her was more interesting than the thing behind her. I have the hammer on my desk. I pick it up sometimes. It's heavier than it looks. Somewhere there's a model of us that just got a new entry. The entry says, unknown variable present, subjects capable of observation, reassess, that's enough. For now, that's enough. There's one more thing I want to tell you about, because it's been sitting in the back of this account the whole time, and I think it deserves to come forward before I close it out. The day after the entity made its final visit, the perimeter survey, the 6-minute hover, the departure with no sampling, I went back to the clearing alone, Mike hadn't asked me to. Shayna didn't know I was going. I went because I needed to look at the reference point. One more time, the original scorch in the granite with fresh eyes. The clearing was quiet. Mid-morning, cold. The sky the pale gray of late October in Manitoba. The birches had mostly turned and some had dropped their leaves already, and the ground around the clearing was thick with them. I walked to the center of the granite shelf and crouched down next to the scorch point and looked at it for a long time. The lichen was there. The adapted community, the organisms that had built their lives on the altered mineral chemistry that 43 years of heat had created. It's of pale olive and dark rust and one species I'd never been able to name. Sheena had called it by a Cree word I couldn't reproduce accurately, meaning roughly the thing that grows where fire has been. They were slow-growing organisms, patient. They'd had 43 years to colonize a 6-square-meter zone, and they'd done it methodically, species by species, each one finding its niche in the altered substrate. My mother had spent 3 weeks cataloging them. She'd been thorough. Her notes in Mike's files covered 11 species, their relative abundance, their distribution across the scorch zone, the moisture and pH preferences she'd inferred from their positions. 11 species in a community that had no right to exist, built on a substrate that had no natural explanation, and she'd written down every one of them, with the same care she'd have given to a pristine, alpine meadow. I took out the notebook and I finished her survey. It took most of the morning. I'm not a botanist. I don't have her training or her vocabulary, and I'm sure my species identifications are rough at best. I used the hand lens and I wrote down what I saw: color, growth form, substrate relationship, relative abundance, position within the scorch zone. 11 species she'd identified, plus 2. I found at the southern edge of the colony that she hadn't noted, possibly because they'd spread south in the 2 years since her survey. 13 species total. A thriving community doing what communities do, adapting, spreading, building something from the materials at hand. I thought about what the entity made of this clearing. Whether it understood what it was looking at when it descended to the reference point and ran its sampling beam across the granite. Whether its instruments registered the organisms at the surface. Whether it cataloged them the way my mother had. Whether somewhere in its data set there was an entry for each of those species. The same species she'd written down in the same careful notation. Whether it had ever considered that the organisms it was sampling were sampling it back. Taking in its heat, metabolizing the altered chemistry it had created. Building their entire metabolism around the repeating input of a thing that descended from the sky, predictable, schedule, and warmed their substrate. The lichen didn't know what the entity was. The lichen didn't need to know. It had adapted to the conditions of its environment and it was using those conditions to live. Maybe that's all any of us are doing. I finished the survey and closed the notebook and sat in the clearing for a while. The forest was doing what forests do in late October, preparing for winter, closing down, tucking things away for the cold months. Birch leaves were coming down 1 or 2 at a time in the still air. A woodpecker was working somewhere in the middle distance. The clearing was just a clearing, cold granite and pale sky, and the smell of wet stone. I picked up a chip of granite from the pile I'd made 2 days earlier when I'd struck the rock in front of the entity. Turned it in my fingers. It was ordinary rock, nothing remarkable. Gray, dense, a few metallite inclusions that caught the flat light. A piece of the Canadian shield that had been here since before our species existed. Put it in my pocket, next to the one I'd pocketed in front of the entity. 2 chips off the same rock. One collected in the presence of something that crossed whatever distance it crossed to study us. One collected alone in an empty clearing on a cold morning in October. Same rock, same hammer, same hand. I walked out of the clearing and back down the trail toward the cabin. The leaves came down around me in 1s and 2s, and the woodpecker kept working, and behind me, the clearing was just a clearing, ordinary and quiet. My mother's survey is complete now. 11 species in my 2, all logged, all measured as carefully as I could manage. It's in the notebook which is in my pack, which is on its way back to Chicago where I'll add it to the copies I've made of Mike's data and file it somewhere safe. The record is there. That's what matters. What happened in that clearing on the morning of October 14th matters. Because it happened and was observed and was written down. Because my uncle spent a decade taking readings no one asked for. Because a woman from Chicago drove up to Falcon Lake to look at unusual lichen and wrote down what she found. Because a 20-year-old followed the approach vector in his uncle's notes to its logical conclusion and held a notebook full of someone else's observations, and let the thing in the sky understand what it was looking at. None of us knew what we were building until it was already built. That's usually how it goes, I think. You take your readings, you write your notes, you pass the notebook to someone who adds to it and passes it to someone else, and somewhere in the accumulated record is a moment where the thing you've been observing looks back and recalibrates. We're good at this. Patient, methodical, incapable of walking past something unusual without needing to understand it. Built for it, maybe. In the same way the lichen is built for the altered chemistry of a specific patch of granite in Manitoba, adapted over generations to the specific conditions of a world that is full of things we can't explain and can't stop investigating. That's the unknown variable. That's the thing that doesn't fit the model. The hammer is onto my desk. The notebook is in my bag. The lichen is still growing at Falcon Lake, south by 2 meters. Patient and methodical, and adapted to conditions it didn't choose. The record is there. I drove back to Chicago at the end of October. The truck still burned oil and pulled left, and I crossed back out of Manitoba into the gray flatness of the Midwest thinking about something Mike had said on my last night at the cabin. We'd been sitting with the stove going. The data spread between us the way we'd sat every night for 6 weeks. He'd been looking at the temperature chart from the October 14th visit. The spike to its new maximum, and then the departure. And he'd said, quietly, the thing he hadn't said in 10 years of working alone. Someone should know about this. I'd thought about that for a moment, about what it meant to know about something. The RCMP officer who'd filed the 1967 report knew about it. The Department of National Defense analysts who'd written the memo about undetermined radioactive origin knew about it. Mike knew about it. Mother had known about it in the last 3 weeks of her life. Shayna knew about it. Knowing about something and being able to act on what you know, that's a different distance than it looks from the outside. Most of what we know sits in files and notebooks, and the memories of people who were there, and the world moves around it without ever quite making contact. Someone does know, I said. We know. That's a start. He looked at the hammer on his desk for a long time. Then he nodded once and reached over and put it in my hands. Your mother would agree with that, he said. I believe him. I think she would.